Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on. For listeners and watchers, I'm joined by Sahaj Sharda, who is the CEO and co-founder of the Antifraud Company. We're sitting here in Midtown Manhattan, really excited for the conversation. Sahaj, why don't you tell us what the Antifraud Company is and why it needs to exist?
Yeah, so I think the best way to understand the Anti-Fraud Company is we're sort of like a new age journalism company. And our reason for being is we feel like, maybe the American immune system when it comes to government spending around things like fraud or corporate misconduct is really, really weak. And we think there are a lot of structural reasons that's the case. The business model for investigative journalism has been getting worse and worse and worse as a secular trend over the last 40, 50 years with the rise of the internet and all these new different types of business models. And so you can generate just as engaging content, basically quote tweeting something as opposed to doing like a proper investigation and reporting it firsthand. So what that means is that people are investing less and less in investigative journalism. And we think that's a really big problem because what that means is people who are organized grifters, who do things at a systemic scale, don't get caught for a very long period of time, and they can end up stealing more and more money from the federal government or defrauding people in all sorts of systemically harmful ways. And so there's a Government Accountability Office study which estimates that on the order of $500 billion a year in federal spending, almost $500 billion a year in federal spending is essentially just fraudulent schemes, just completely a hidden tax on the American taxpayer, where it's not actually improving services. In fact, it may be doing the opposite. And so we think that's a really big problem. And so what we decided to do is structure a company around investigative journalism with a different type of business model. So whereas previously you might sell subscriptions or sell ads around your content or your investigations, what we're doing is we're trying to monetize through lawsuits. And there's a variety of whistleblower programs in the United States. The SEC has one, the CFTC has one, the Antitrust Division at the DOJ just launched one. There's some statutory ones like the False Claims Act. We're learning about these sort of whistleblower programs and how we can conduct investigations in a way that both sort of exposes corporate misdoing, but also creates an avenue for us to monetize, the value we've created through these whistleblower programs and subsequent enforcement actions by the government to actually stop those schemes. And that's really what the Anti-Fraud Company is all about.
I often feel kind of aggrieved, which is the second time I've said to you today that I feel aggrieved, but by the kind of rise of tech that helps you reg, that a lot of like the growth, certainly in Europe, it feels like a lot of our kind of cutting edge businesses are actually just helping people get around regulations, but you're actually doing tech that helps you reg in order to go to the heart of the thing that means that regulation is there in the first place, which is an ever-growing state. Does more government beget more bad actors as opposed to just kind of like an average volume that you would expect to see like in the private sector, say?
The way I think about what we do and the value we provide is to, at least on the margin, decrease the amount of just outright fraud or schemes that were not intended by the framers of those programs. Now, you can have all sorts of prospective views on should we shrink the size of government? Should we eliminate certain programs? How should we restructure what we're doing? And, from a corporate point of view, we really don't have a specific point of view on that. We're looking at, to the extent things exist, let's just make them slightly more workable or make sure that at the very least, people aren't stealing.
This is about bad actors, but it's also about getting precedent through the legal system to encourage better and more efficient behavior on the back of that. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right way to think about it. There are all sorts of regulatory schemes or statutory schemes that are erected all the time. New ones layered on top of old ones, with increasing levels of complexity. And what that also does is create a lot of ambiguity. So if I'm inside a corporation, let's say I'm inside United Healthcare or one of these other giant conglomerates, and I want to pad my profits, I'm going to look for potentially ambiguous or poorly defined regulations or places where I can come up with a misinterpretation to pad profits, but also, potentially lower the amount of legal risk I'm taking. I think what the Anti-Fraud Company does is, to the extent that we think those, interpretations are completely in bad faith, completely, in our view, sometimes fraudulent, we're going to try and build a case, build an enforcement action. And the long tail of that is that other corporations that are in the industry, other industry participants, have cleaner lines around which conduct is and isn't allowed.
It's really a great leveler against state privilege. That's another way I look at this. Yeah. Like the bigger you are, the more you can lobby, the more barriers to entry suit you, etc. And this like gives something of a reset towards efficiency and, as you say, setting the standard and expectations for an industry at large. What are the most egregious practices and behaviors that you've uncovered so far?
Ongoing investigations, as a matter of corporate policy, we don't talk about because the element of surprise is very important in our business. And anything that we would have filed is usually filed under seal. And what that means is we're actually not legally allowed to talk about it. But I can talk about sort of broad areas or broad types of fraud that both we've identified, other people have identified, and that as the Antifraud Company, we're really interested in. Things like overbilling, things like junk fees, lying about which services are provided. And there are all sorts of games like this. Other types of schemes are kickbacks, essentially corrupting the competitive process, either through middlemen or people in the government. There's a whole range of these types of schemes, specifically in healthcare, but that you can generalize more broadly across the federal government, that the Anti-Fraud Company is very, very interested in. Some of it relates to corruption, including inside of government, but often it's more corrupt business practices or sort of fraudulent schemes within different middlemen and private actors.
What does the world look like when you've succeeded?
I think what the world looks like when the Anti-Fraud Company succeeds is that we're really a pillar of American law enforcement. We're helping bring these types of cases year after year after year, and that $500 billion a year stat has gone dramatically down. And if we can make a dent like that, I think this will be one of the most important companies, not just for the people inside it, but for the broader American taxpayer, for the public, and for every person who doesn't want taxes to go up and to the right in perpetuity.
Do you see there being an existential issue with procurement as a process, as a thing?
Anytime you have single points of failure, there's always going to be incentives to game that system. I think, this is one of the reasons that I'm an anti-monopolist. I think we don't want centralized decision-making points because there are always these incentives for corruption and sort of backroom dealings. My view is that, there sometimes aren't even issues in procurement per se. Maybe, the system is opened up to bids, but it's more the stuff around that, right? Bid rigging would be a classical type of fraud that the Anti-Fraud Company would want to investigate, where people are colluding with their competitors to rotate bids or rotate programs. And these are the types of issues that I think the Anti-Fraud Company can squarely address. Is there an inherent issue? I think there is with any single point of failure. And to the extent that we can prevent that, that's always prospectively the best thing to do.
I suppose there's the natural corollary of the leveling that you're doing is that smaller businesses can compete against incumbents, at least within the existing system, but that in itself augments the fabric of the existing system by having more businesses that can enter and exit and be part of even a quasi-market.
Yeah, a very simple example I would give is we don't want a form of capitalism where the way you get the contract is by giving a kickback to the procurement officer or to his family. That is not a form of capitalism that we want. I would say it's actually not capitalism. It's sort of state capture, quasi-socialistic. And so I think what we want to do as a company is at least draw lines around the most egregious forms of that type of conduct and minimize that. And I think that at the very least opens up the bidding process as, however poorly or well it's structured, for smaller companies to come in and put their best foot forward.
Does it irk you, just on that point around capitalism, that I think a lot of people mistake corporatism and indeed corruption for capitalism? Does that bother you? Do you feel like there's also a role to play with what you're doing and saying to people actually this isn't normal, we can call it out, this is what capitalism and a market actually looks like, and this is why it benefits individuals?
Yeah, I have very strong views on this. I think, what frustrates most people about quote unquote capitalism is that it's often crony socialism. In the United States, we have this sort of 20, 30, 40-year history of bailouts for all sorts of massive corporations that completely played fast and loose with the rules and were rewarded for their bad behavior.
And you've written about this, and you wrote about it quite young.
Yes.
What motivated you to do that?
Yeah, so I was an undergraduate student at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., And while I was there was sort of this scandal that erupted. It was called in the United States the Varsity Blues scandal. And the essential controversy was that wealthy people like D-list celebrities were bribing athletic coaches at a variety of schools at Yale, at Georgetown, at USC to get their kids in. And the way they would get their kids in is they would have their kids pose as athletes.
Literally.
No, it was legitimately posed. What I found very interesting about it was at Georgetown, where, again, the demographics are such that many of the students are from wealthy backgrounds. What people found objectionable, what the student body found objectionable about this set of facts wasn't that, there was corruption in admissions. It was that the parents who had participated in these schemes had been cheap. They hadn't paid the proper donation to the development office. They'd sort of try to get a discount through the athletic recruiter. And I thought that was a completely insane way to internalize what was happening. And it made me really question, what are these universities here to do? And that started sort of an academic journey for me. I spent a couple of years researching and writing this book, The College Cartel, where I basically asked a series of questions around what do elite colleges supply and how do they do it? It ended up becoming this broader thesis around the anti-competitiveness of elite universities, how they collude with each other on prices, on things like admissions, on output, and how all of this leads to really, really high prices for essentially worse and worse products over time. And, a big part of that story is sort of their closeness to the state, this form of crony socialism, where no matter how much you raise tuition, the infinite subsidy of student loans will continue to allow you to do that more and more and more every single year. And no matter how anti-competitively you're behaving or how much you're colluding in this cartel structure, the taxpayer will continue to loan you money. This is exactly the form of crony socialism we need to end, and that as an ideological matter, I'm against, and as a corporate matter, that we'd be very interested in investigating.
Under crony socialism, rather than fairness being an emergent property, so that behavior you described of the thing that's annoying me is that the parents aren't paying full whack, rather than the moral position of how what they're doing is just wrong. Fairness becomes a systematic and prescribed thing that can be defined by one group versus another group. And I suppose it just shows that humans will just shift their sense of cooperation and defect into whatever scenario they're in. But I think it means we've completely lost a sense of fairness and equality as emergent properties that actually are reached through merit. Because once you've got a system where you can't access merit because someone's paying someone else, etc., it just shifts what becomes wrong and what becomes right, in a really concerning way.
No, and this is where I really, sort of take a lefty perspective on class-based morality, right? I think the sort of, and you're British, I think it's even more pronounced in your society, but sort of the upper classes have a very different view of what is fair or unfair within the confines of, within the four corners of their part of society. Middle class people found Varsity Blues entirely objectionable for the meritocratic reason that you just indicated. And that's really the lens through which I interpreted it too. And so I think, there are these sort of complete disconnects between what fairness ought to mean. That's not a very good direction for the United States to be trending towards. I think this has always been historically a more egalitarian country. There's the Horace Greeley idea of go west, young man. There's always been the land of opportunity. And when we're getting more and more stratified and you're starting to notice these very distinct class-based, different moral codes, this is part of the disconnect and part of why there's so much polarization and so much resentment that's building up in American society.
One of the things that concerns me is that people will vote for more state potentially in the face of a burgeoning state causing some of the stuff that makes it difficult for them to get on in life. If you have government increasingly controlling money supply, if you have different sectors, whether it's housing, whether it's energy flooded with liquidity through state intervention, it actually makes it harder for people to get on ladders and move upwards and outwards in life. And when you're somewhere like New York, where there's a huge class of people who are here following the American dream, that feels concerning. Is that to me feels like the other side of the coin that you're describing. Is that how you see it?
All of those things are concerning to me, but maybe perhaps I also have a broader area of concern around the private sector too. A lot of the emerging tech companies of the 2020s, I find to be deeply dystopian. I think it's a bad thing that Polymarket is getting a whole new generation of Americans addicted to gambling. I think it's a bad thing that people are addicted to TikTok, which is a form of, sort of digital opium. And I think it's a bad thing that the algorithms are pushing more and more titillating sexual content to younger and younger people. All of these things are, to me, deeply dystopian. It's sort of like the end state ends up with that scene in WALL-E where everyone's sort of fat and addicted to their screens and demoralized and not self-actualizing. And so I think, from my point of view, the core issue is central planners who don't have a sense of loyalty to the people that they're planning for. Now, that might be in government, but it very easily is inside of these monopolistic corporations on the private side too. And there have been so many, sort of gains from scale in the digital economy that you have more and more of those in the private sector every single day. And I find those both to be dangerous and troubling trends.
I think an interesting thing to touch on, particularly for our viewers over in Europe and the UK, is whether you've looked at or know about alternative routes. Obviously, we don't have Lincoln's Law, False Claims Act. In the UK, for example, is the Antifraud Company able to go multi-geo? How do you think about that?
In the US, there's a federal sort of patchwork of whistleblower programs. There's Lincoln's Law, which has been around since, I think it's 1862 or 1863, and has a long history in the United States. But then there's also, agency-specific whistleblower programs, whether it's at the SEC or the CFTC or the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, where there's this profit motive has sort of been leveraged increasingly as a secular trend. These whistleblower programs at the federal level are proliferating. But then there's also a patchwork of state-level False Claims Act type laws. I think it's on the order of 30 or so states have a version of this type of law. And again, the United States having a federalist system means that those are all potential areas of opportunity for us too. And so that's keeping us pretty busy for the foreseeable future. But to the extent that this can work in other countries, I think you would need a couple of different prerequisites. One is really strong rule of law. I don't necessarily think that this model can work in a third world country where the corruption is sort of par for the course and courts are just as corrupt as the other institutions in their societies. Where this could work is in either emerging economies that have really cleaned up the amount of corruption in the judiciary, or in sort of incumbent developed economies, sort of in places like Europe, where there's a sort of motivation to move towards some of these different types of business models and enforcement efforts.
Doge, failed project. What's your diagnosis there?
I think it was a good idea with just some of the worst execution. And I think there are a couple of structural reasons for that. First of all, I think a lot of the people that were hired by Doge are obviously brilliant. I mean, their track records before, and I'm sure after will bear that out. But, there is something that is often different about bureaucracies, which is the information flows are not as obvious as inside of Twitter or in the tech world, where the data sources are very clean. You can sort of plug and play and figure out what's happening from first principles a little bit more easily. And so I think, one of the issues with Doge is they started cutting as opposed to thinking through where all the bodies were buried. And they thought, from the feedback that we get from our actions, we'll find more and more stuff. But politics doesn't always work that way.
I suppose the thing that I find interesting is this playing institutions off each other, this cannibalization, if we're being lofty about it, or just massive efficiency gains. There's a flushing out which gives an opportunity to be more originalist in an approach to government and governance. So that's what feels exciting about the Antifraud Company at scale and the kind of approach and behaviors it can inculcate.
Whenever you're starting something new and you're up against the most well-resourced adversaries in the world, you should have some clever approach which allows your relatively small size to be an advantage and not a disadvantage. And I think that's really what we've built the Antifraud Company around, is how can we make sure that we're picking fights that we feel very confident about, that we're very likely to win, and that we can rally supporters who are much bigger than us, much more powerful than us, but are also interested in helping us win that fight.
If someone was going to criticize what you're doing at the Antifraud Company, what would they say?
The sort of really pejorative, unfair view of the Antifraud Company is that we're sort of ambulance chasers. We're just looking to impose liability on corporations trying to do their best in a broken system, that we are parasitic and inherently profit-seeking parasites that are sort of taking advantage of a regulatory scheme. And I really must say I do push back on that characterization. There's a lot of stuff at the Anti-Fraud Company that we've already found in our first 6 months of existing that we are not acting on whatsoever, because we either think, the requisite level of wrongdoing isn't there, or we don't think, the intentionality is there. Some people in our shoes would treat these as lottery tickets. We don't do that. We take a very deterministic view on each and every single investigation and each and every single potential case. And only if we feel inherently confident in the merits, that we are actually on the right side, that we're actually telling the truth, that we've gotten to the bottom of it, do we think about proceeding in a legal fashion. Anyone who is figuring out how to maintain their credibility in this sort of new age journalism landscape, whether it's Hunter Brook, whether it's the Anti-Fraud Company, whether it's other corporations, would do well to not treat these things, not treat investigations as lottery tickets, even if the business model allows for it, and play loose with facts, because your credibility is really all you have, and I would say is the moat.
We've discussed the fact you've written a book and you're now running a company. What are the differences you consciously observe around how you spend and order your time?
I would say that, writing a book was for me at least, and this is again before ChatGPT, I may have been the last book before ChatGPT came out, but was a little bit lonely, but that also allowed me to really have like sort of long feedback loops where I was thinking through the implications of all sorts of ideas. And as I was doing that, it was a nonfiction book. It was around what I felt were corruptish commercial practices and broken systems of incentives. And it allowed me to think really deeply around how would you structure institutions? What are the right sets of incentives? What are the right governance models? How do you incentivize people to do the things that you want them to do? How would you think about financing in alternative ways? And in some ways, I think it was really good preparation for thinking through business problems, because I was thinking about how would I restructure the education system? How would I restructure the education market? And so when it came time to, thinking about what are the issues in other types of markets, I was able to lean on some of those, sort of methodologies of thinking, modalities of thinking around what is right, what is wrong, how would you structure the incentives better. Day to day, at the Anti-Fraud Company, I now get to apply those, sort of theories that I developed over this long period of just thinking about things. And in practice, I'm getting some feedback, which is validating a lot of the stuff I thought, which is disvalidating a lot of the stuff I thought to be true, and is very iterative. And I think these two types of things are both really useful. And I would encourage anyone to spend, one period of their life really thinking about stuff and another period really trying to do things quickly, because I think both help you really grow as a person.
Do you think university is a scam? And what is the longest lever we have for changing education?
If you think about what has changed most in our society over like the last 40 years, let's say, there's been an information technology revolution. No one denies that, right? The internet, ChatGPT, YouTube, even Wikipedia for an earlier generation of sort of learners. And you think about throughout American history, at least, we had this history of autodidacts, people who essentially taught themselves. Abraham Lincoln famously, he went in the back of a barn, he borrowed a bunch of law books, he taught himself the law and became, sort of a magisterial lawyer in Illinois before becoming a congressman, before becoming the president. And you would imagine that in a world where there's YouTube and ChatGPT and Wikipedia, we would have way more Abraham Lincolns, self-directed learners with much more access to information who would be just as good, maybe better. And yet it seems that society has been trending in the complete opposite direction. In the information dissemination market, which is what the universities are supposed to be, prices have gone up and to the right. And the cost of inputs, you would think, because of all these technological shifts, would have meant the prices were supposed to go down and to the right. One thing that we can conclude is that universities aren't about informational dissemination. So if your question is, are universities a scam? Well, they're a scam if you think they're about learning. If you think that they're about other things, then maybe they're not a scam.
What would you say to a 15, 16-year-old who is thinking about heading off to university?
Unfortunately, we live in a very credentialist society. So as a pragmatic point, I would not discourage anyone from going and getting a degree. The sort of advice I would give to any young person, whether they are or aren't in university, is let your curiosity run away with you. This is the best time there's ever been for ideas people. And I think everyone has a great idea. They just need to discover it within.
What are your thoughts on the future of media? Because you enter the media market as well as all the other markets that you're touch pointing at a time of like massive consolidation, big upheavals. Great for talent, but what are your thoughts there?
One of the things that we've realized at the Antifraud Company is that these sort of stories of fraud and of challenging fraud, but even of just exposing fraud itself, has a really resonant quality. The algorithms really push this stuff. And so maybe you might think of it as doomer porn, everyone's corrupt, everything's bad, let's retweet this, let's like this, let's watch this, let's get some schadenfreude out of it. Or another way to think about it is, oh, someone's doing something about this, finally, this is what we've been waiting for. It's more maybe hope core adjacent content. Either way, we feel that we can get a lot of distribution when we put out content around what we're investigating and what we're finding. I think the hedge fund model is an interesting one. It's not my core area of expertise. I could never have built something like Hunterbrook, but I think it's a very interesting approach on this general problem. And I think we're going to see more approaches outside of the Antifraud Company and Hunterbrook. I think other people will have ideas on how you can monetize some of this stuff. It may not always be legal. It may be, sort of we learn something about what's going on that's bad and we help the company clean it up. There may be other types of models like this that I'm not even able to think of yet. But once you see it, you'll know, oh, there's something there. And so I think this is an important challenge for our time around how do you finance the creating of the content. The content itself, I think, has inherently viral characteristics.
Tell us about the founding team.
Yeah, so I have two co-founders. The first is David Barclay. He's formerly a member of the FTC. He used to work for Lena Khan across her sort of healthcare pharmaceutical portfolio. And the way that David and I met was that he was on Twitter sort of mouthing off about issues with the healthcare system, but in a level of specificity that really wasn't resonating with anyone except for someone like me. I followed him, I DM'd him, and the next time I was in Washington, D.C., we sort of went on a walk and discussed our ideas about how we could make more change in the system. He and I sort of bonded over trying to figure out new business models, trying to figure out how you can make remunerative the work of finding corporate misconduct. And when the time came to where I thought the Antifraud Company was a good idea and I wanted to build out a very high density sort of talented team, I naturally reached out to David to be a co-founder. My other co-founder is Alex Shia. He's most famous for sending an email to all the administrators at Brown University, asking them what they essentially do all week during like the peak Doge fervor. And Alex is a brilliant technologist. He's our chief technology officer. He has this sort of brilliant bicameral mind between deep technological problem solving, database connection, ontology, all of this stuff, and also how to communicate it. David has a ton of regulatory expertise, is sort of a creative loose cannon, can go off at any point with really the next brilliant idea. And I'm someone who sort of also has a bit of that, a bit of what Alex has, sort of also am a little bit more commercially minded maybe than both of them. And so our team really benefits, I think, from being together and from there being so many independent centers of authority and essentially of ideation within the company, which is in any type of creative enterprise, always the best.
Let's talk a bit about building the Antifraud Company in terms of the team and how you're growing it. Tell us about the team at the moment and how you're thinking about expansion and kind of routes forward.
Yeah, I think it's now 8 or 9 people that are working at the Antifraud Company or with the Antifraud Company. We have a lot of incredibly talented engineers and engineering talent who help us build different types of ontologies or connect different types of data sets to essentially invert the sort of surveillance capitalism model. Historically, someone like Google or Facebook has spied on people and profited from their insights into people. And essentially, what we're trying to do is allow the citizen to spy on the corporation. And so we're trying to invert the model. That's one piece. Another piece is we're working with really great investigative journalists who are incredible at what they do, incredible at sourcing leads, the human part, maybe you would say, of our business. And then we have a bunch of I would say I call them ideas guys. You might say they're, legal folks, but people who can have an intuition for which types of lawsuits or enforcement actions and where the conduct is that would sort of support those types of lawsuits of enforcement actions that can be successful are. So those are the three types of people at the Antifraud Company right now. But we're always looking to add more individuals. I think, there are probably areas that we haven't thought about where people can contribute and be amazing teammates. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in our mission to figure out how they can contribute and reach out.
What motivates you?
It's not exactly commercial success, but I am interested in figuring out a business model that works. That to me is a great intellectual challenge because I think this has historically been a graveyard for startups. I think, the first wave of new type media companies, BuzzFeed, Vice, all these guys essentially went bust. And so I think this is a very challenging place in which to operate. I think we have a very differentiated, interesting, novel way at getting at this stuff. And what motivates me is seeing that through and making this team really successful.
So the thing I find interesting is that a lot of the sinews between democracy and law today are found in the fact that we have a positive rights paradigm. Like I have a right to life, a right to family life. And we used to have a paradigm of negative rights. You have no right to kill me. And certainly like something like the False Claims Act is old enough and established enough that it's essentially a negative duty on private actors. And I find that intriguing because it almost like allows us to go back to actually if you strengthen the rule of law like as it has been, rather than just create more laws, that can actually be a more efficacious way forward. Or at least, that's what I buy into, presumably what you buy into. But more broadly, what are your thoughts about the future of law? We could talk about AI as well, and whether we end up with a huge amount of drafting going on and then people using AIs to kind of pass stuff that's being drafted, etc. It just feels like an interesting time.
Yeah, there's that concept like Givon's paradox, right? Like if the efficiency of something goes up a little bit, does the demand go up even more? And so do you end up using more of that good? And I think law is an area where actually AI is perfectly situated within this Givon's paradox because it's zero sum, sort of the plaintiff and the defendant are essentially fighting over who gets what within bounds. And if it's cheaper to try and incur costs on your counterparty, people will try to do that even more. And as a natural response, if the plaintiff tries that, the defendant has to sort of respond tit for tat. And so we'll end up with not more efficient legal systems, but certainly more paper being exchanged, would be my sort of pessimistic prediction on how AI and the law intersect. But if you're looking out for huge efficiency gains or lawsuits settling earlier or things like this, I'm not holding my breath.
Sahaj, thank you so much for coming on and taking the time. Where can people find out more about the Antifraud Company? Anyone in particular you'd like to be speaking to?
People can find us on X. They can go to our website, antifraudcompany.com, and they can reach out to us over email or over Twitter. I would say that the types of people that I would love to connect with are people for whom this mission really resonates and who feel that they may have some unique way in which they're able to contribute, whatever that might be.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.